Hi all, it's me Aki from Bring Forth, and I'd like to talk about actually Cyan from Bring Forth currently, and I'd like to talk about Bronze Age tribes, one of my favorite topics. And Bronze Age people moved around a lot. They, as their main center, had this thing called Tula, which means the tribe home or living space or region or space, depending on how you translate it. And they had a surprisingly democratic government type. All the noblemen, or the what we would call high class people, were invited to this thing called Thingaz, which is Proto-German and means the thing, where they gathered and shared ideas and had, much like the Greek city-states, they had their form of decentralized government, and there was no hereditary king, and somebody was elected king, and they had to go through an election. It wasn't possible to go through just a normal Western type divine mandate kinghood, where you get to be king because God basically told you so. What you had in those eras was a lot of clans that, when necessary, formed into tribes and kingdoms, and their Tula was remarkably easy to build on a quick note. It only took some days, perhaps not even days, to get a proper Tula organized. And they had their houses made from solid pieces of wood, and it was called the stead. And they built the walls from solid pieces of wood. They didn't turn them into lumber because they didn't have the time for it. It was much easier to simply make a stead, and basically a short form of the housing that we see today. So they didn't really ever build houses, even though they had the ability to do so. So most of their housing in the modern era has disintegrated into nothing and isn't around anymore. And they had various god myths. So they had this different time called the god time, and they had a method of gathering the entire tribe together to reenact these god myths so that they could get more power from their god. In reality, it was most likely from the better coordination of the people of the tribe, not from any specific entity, though it's possible it was from entities. It's kind of hard to know. So they basically had this tribal structure where clans migrated fairly freely and were mobile and didn't have housing in the same way that we do today. And some of their advancements in agriculture from the Bronze Age are only now being understood because, for example, we can't really farm in the Amazon forest itself. We need to clear cut the forest, and then the soil is only good for a few years. And they had some kind of method of using burnt pieces of clay to make the land fertile. We don't really understand it completely, but it is something that we are studying, because a lot of this information vanishes every time we have a technological paradigm shift. So a lot of these Bronze Age people are actually more advanced than their current era counterparts in many ways, but that is basically the price we have to pay for societal development. And a lot of these tribes had in their way of life cattle raiding and kinds of wars that we don't really understand as wars, because they didn't try to kill or even displace the other tribe. They tried to make them poorer by raiding their cattle and trying to take their farmland and so on. It's interesting because a lot of these Bronze Age tribes had a lot of very what I would call is complex god time, and even their modern farming and medicines were in many ways more advanced than ours. So by studying something like this past tribe, you get an understanding of the modern world that is much better than just having a modern understanding of the world. You need to understand how these ancient tribes lived and talked and had their lives. The way I see it, we need something of the clan structure in our current world to understand the high mobility of these corporations that specialize in warfare, like Blackwater. They are very much like Bronze Age clans of their own creation. They have their own structures that resemble the Bronze Age clan structure. Anyway, that's all I want to say about the Bronze Age people. It's something of a historical interest of mine. And the way I see it, they are in many ways more advanced than we are, but we should not forget that we are in many ways more advanced than they are. So it's hard to say who is more advanced in reality, but we can all learn a lot from them.